what do you think of the weather?
What a wonderful thing to ask in England. And absolutely, you know, the heart of Englishness, I suppose, because here we are in Oxford with these incredible dreaming spires.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of the Ecocide Report from Stop Ecocide International, part of the movement for Ecocide Law internationally. I'm here with my good friend, Jojo. My name is Professor Chidi Obihara. Jojo.
Chidi, it's great to see you again. It's been quite a while, which means that we've got an awful lot to catch up on. We've got a fantastic location this time. We're here at my alma mater, which is St Hilda's College, Oxford, in a beautiful, newly constructed building that has the most extraordinary views of the spires in the background. So yeah, a real privilege, and big thank you to St Hilda's College for hosting us today.
You're right, the views are spectacular, it's a great venue. And if we start with the Office of the Prosecutor for Public Consultations and Responses, because we know that a lot has happened to try and consolidate international ecocide law.
This is a new development, actually. So the Chief Prosecutor from the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, earlier this year declared that his office are going to be putting together a policy paper this year on how the Rome Statute in its current form could address environmental destruction, environmental crimes, which is a really interesting acknowledgement of the fact that environmental crimes are very much under-addressed in international law, and even where crimes do exist, they're not reported, investigated, prosecuted at anything like the level they should be, given how incredibly criminally lucrative and engaged in they are, if you like. So the prosecutor put out a consultation, and many, received many responses from that. But a number of them, and from quite high-profile people too, were flagging up what of course we did in our response, which is to say that, obviously it's a step in the right direction to be looking at how the existing statute, which covers genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression, could potentially address environmental destruction, but that in order to do so in a really comprehensive manner and to the level that is needed, a standalone crime of ecocide is needed. And of course, that's the ultimate goal of our advocacy work worldwide. Some of those respondents included the head of Client Earth, Laura Clark, included the co-president of the Club of Rome, Sandrine Dixon-de-Clèves, and a number of other very significant names, including, of course, the Minister for Climate Change from the Republic of Vanuatu, Minister Ralph Regenvanu.
So are any of their responses available for people to see?
So yes, there's a whole section on our website, stopecocide.earth, which covers this consultation and the responses and so on. So that's been fascinating.
Excellent. And in that same vein of sort of international ecocide crime, there's the European Crime Directive as well, isn't there?
There is indeed. Now, this is a process, the Environmental Crimes Directive that the EU has been revising over the last couple of years has been, quite a long drawn-out process. But that process did come to a conclusion, and a very positive one from our perspective, earlier this year. So there was political agreement reached in November. In February, the European Parliament passed the text that was agreed. In March, the European Council did, and it was finally formalised in May. So there is now an Environmental Crimes Directive in existence in the EU, which addresses crimes comparable to ecocide. Now, it's the first time that the word ecocide has been used in EU law. It's not in the operative part of the text, but it's described in the preamble or the recitals, as they're known, that it will address crimes of this degree. So it's almost being treated as a kind of an aggravating factor. There's a range of crimes, but if any of them are committed to a certain level, creating a certain severity of harm, then there's a new layer of penalties that kick in. It effectively lifts it to the level of ecocide. So this is an extraordinary milestone, and it's been absolutely key in shifting the conversation also at the international level, at the level of the International Criminal Court, so that this whole initiative is being taken very seriously now also at the level of the ICC. And of course, European member states now have 2 years to transpose that directive into their own penal codes. And from the perspective of our work, of course, we have chapters, associate teams in many different countries, including many European countries. And there's now a focus on effectively encouraging European capitals to, in a sense, to go that extra mile and to create a standalone crime of ecocide, if at all possible. Because there is something about putting that outer parameter in place where you say that whatever you do, it should not reach this level of harm, that actually creates a shift in the way people think about what they're doing. They stop trying to game the system and say, oh, I'm not in this category and we're not quite hitting this, red line, and instead start thinking about what are we doing on the ground and is it likely to create that level of harm? And of course, that is ultimately our goal. It's about protection. It's about changing practices.
100%. And the great thing about that is that this was driven publicly by a petition as well, wasn't there?
Indeed. So we collaborated with a number of different organisations, including We Move Europe, including Avars. And of course, there were some amazing MEPs who also really drove this conversation, people like Marie Toussaint, people like Saskia Brikmont, and others. And indeed, the sort of development over the years of this conversation, in the EU took a lot of actors, it took a lot of pressure, and a lot of collaboration, and that is very much a part of how we feel we're approaching all of this. One voice is never enough. It's always about bringing in as many different supporting organisations and voices as possible, because the louder the conversation gets, the faster it moves.
100%, you create momentum. And the great thing, of course, about EU action, something like the European Crime Directive, is that thanks to issues like subsidiarity, the operational aspects of this come down to the state level.
That's right.
And you've been working on that as well. Could you talk in a bit more detail about the individual domestic state level action?
Well, this is really exciting because when we first started, we aimed specifically in our advocacy work for the International Criminal Court, partly for many reasons, but one of them was coherence, because we figured if you go kind of state by state, you could end up with different definitions, different approaches, everything taking an incredibly long time, which, as we all know, we don't have, and so what's been really interesting is to see that since the proposed international definition came out in 2021, there's actually been, it's sort of triggered, if you like, and catalyzed a lot of political conversation in individual jurisdictions. But actually what we're seeing is that there is that kind of coherence emerging precisely because that definition is what has inspired it. Just last week, actually, Italy's Green Left Alliance, which had drafted a proposed bill last year, has now actually, that's properly been introduced into the parliamentary process in Italy. Moving to that, perhaps those who are the most ahead of the game, Belgium, have actually adopted at federal level a crime of ecocide now, making them the first country to adopt it at national level, but with the sense that it is an international level crime. So that's been really important as well. In Peru, there have been no fewer than 3 ecocide bills proposed by 3 different parties over the last couple of months. So that is the conversation that is going to be very, very live in Peru in the upcoming time.
We definitely want that, because it shows that Peru is treating this not as a party political issue, but as a proper, global, important, domestic, basic legal issue.
And this is absolutely key. And actually, perhaps at this point, it might be worth mentioning that, as our viewers will be aware, this is an extraordinary election year. There are elections across half the world this year. And what we've done quite deliberately, actually, is tried to avoid ecocide law becoming an election issue, because it is so foundational. It is absolutely about protecting humanity, protecting nature, protecting civilization into the future, and that should not be a party political issue, and neither should it be an issue where nations pit against each other either. It's absolutely about something that will support everyone, and everyone needs to come on board. And in that context, actually, it's been interesting to see, for example, the business sphere also again, sort of becoming more outspoken about this. In Sweden particularly, where we've also seen, political discussion of ecocide again, which has been really important. But we also saw in Sweden a group of 6 major CEOs publicly endorsing ecocide law and saying that actually this is actually really important for the security of the future economy. So that's been very encouraging to see that there are now key business players that are starting to speak out as well. We've also seen the ruling party in Finland express support for Ecocide Law. We've seen MPs from 3 of Canada's federal political parties supporting it. And at the Council of Europe, which has already issued a resolution last year actively supporting national and international level criminalisation of ecocide, has just recently made another resolution around marine protection where it's also been given a specific mention. So these developments are kind of popping up thick and fast as the conversation becomes very much a normative one.
I understand you had a presence at the United Nations Environment Assembly. Did anything emerge out of that?
That's right. So actually, a couple of interesting things came out of the UN's Environment Assembly this year in Nairobi. One was a joint global statement from the major stakeholders group that specifically recommended Ecocide Law. The other was actually in a different arena, which was more of a faith-based document that emerged called the Al-Mizan, which came from religious and environmental scholars in the Muslim community, bringing forward a statement around how the Islamic world can focus in a faith-based way, if you like, on the protection of and care of creation. And that also mentioned the international criminalisation of ecocide. So it's really so interesting to see how it's popping up in all of these different areas, because there's this growing recognition that it's such a fundamental piece that needs to be put in place.
Are there arguments being developed in Africa that are really relevant right now?
There are certain aspects of the discussions around ecocide law that resonate particularly in Africa. There's a strong human rights connection. I think sometimes in Europe we tend to separate environmental damage and human rights violations. Of course, you go to Africa, Latin America, one of these countries, you can see quite easily how incredibly tightly linked those things are. There's also a sense, I think, in many African countries that companies coming from the global north potentially come in and don't take responsibility for damage or for the approach that they're taking on the ground. And having an international level law of this kind could be really helpful for holding those companies to account and for making sure that actually from the beginning that they're actually approaching their activities in those countries in a different way. And I think there's also a way of kind of rebalancing and refocusing perhaps the conversation around who gets prosecuted at the International Criminal Court. Because there is a history of prosecuting African warlords, dictators, and so on.
Disproportionately.
Yeah, and that's a completely reasonable thing to level at the ICC. But the addition of ecocide to the list of crimes there would actually make a fundamental difference to this, because while ecocidal activity may and often is happening in developing countries, the decisions at high level that lead to those situations very often come from the wealthy north. And so there's a way that this can actually create a cautionary and a deterrent aspect in those contexts, and that is actually very, very important for those countries. And also, and this is also true in Latin American countries, if the local provision legally is not adequate to deal with a situation, an ecocidal situation, for example, and you have environmental land defenders or local communities dealing with issues that perhaps either the judicial system can't or won't deal with in their own countries, having a tool that goes a layer above that is actually reassuring, supporting, and it also helps to shift the narrative as well. It helps to shift it from those people being portrayed as criminals interrupting business activity to actually being moral upholders of the law, where the business activity itself has to be much more carefully thought about if it wants to avoid being criminal.
100% supporting local institutions that may not have the power to enforce or create compliance. That's excellent. Thank you very much for that. And speaking in a bit more detail about climate action on the ground in places like South America, the Escazú COP3 agreement came together. Were you involved in that in any way?
We did have a team there, actually, yes. So the Escazú Agreement is possibly the first international agreement to actively include protection for environmental defenders inside the treaty. And that has been signed by a number of countries across Latin America. And it had its third COP, so COP literally just means Conference of the Parties, so all treaties have COPs. It had its third COP in Chile this spring, and we had representation there. Our Latin America director was there. We also have a Chilean associate campaign on the ground, and there were a couple of events that were put on that brought the Ecocide Law question and conversation into kind of conjunction and complementarity with what's happening with Escazú. So that was, again, an important kind of awareness raiser and kind of one of those dot joining things, because, Ecocide Law has impact in so many areas. It's such a fundamental piece that it's so important that these different conversations, that relate to these different treaties also start considering this legal aspect.
So the Escazú COP is largely about public participation and justice in the environmental movement, which is incredibly apt for the work that we're doing here with consultations, with lobbying to get this international movement going that joins the dots for local and domestic players. But could we talk a bit more detail about the players at UN level that you admire, who are giving you the sort of positive energy you need and leading in the right direction?
Yes, indeed. Not least from the UN Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres. In his report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, Guterres brings up the importance and the need for an international crime. He particularly addressed the devastating effects of the Kakhovka Dam incident in Ukraine, the increase in civilian casualties over the last year, and the need for an international crime to address these severe forms of destruction. Also worth mentioning is there was a remarkable conference held in Amsterdam on protecting the environment and international law and the nexus of those two things, which very much was like a kind of who's who of people dealing with this crossover, if you like, between environmental damage and international law. And there were two amazing keynotes at that conference. One came from the Deputy Prosecutor from the International Criminal Court, Nazhat Shameem Khan, and the other came from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk. And both of them specifically talked about Ecocide Law, about the growth in that conversation, and particularly also mentioned the international proposed definition that came out of our foundation's panel in 2021. So, this is something that is being clocked and publicly talked about in very, very key positions.
There's a lot going on, obviously on an international legislative basis, but then the process of getting that into national assemblies and getting it into practical action is also happening in parallel, which sets quite a busy tone. Are there slightly, I don't want to say calmer, but more cultural or social processes that are going on simultaneously as well?
That's the really exciting thing about this movement, is it really seems to cover so many angles and inspire people in so many different sectors. And in the cultural space, we've had a couple of very different but really, amazing contributions to the global movement. And one of the most remarkable was an extraordinary concert that was held in Helsinki at the end of April by Choirs for Ecocide Law. Now, I had no idea that there are 37 million choral singers in Europe, and that actually in and of itself, that's an extraordinary audience. Not to mention their audiences. And a remarkable project was put together in Helsinki, a collaboration between many choirs, so that there were 1,000 singers at this mega concert, Choirs for Ecocide Law, at the Helsinki Concert Hall, singing a program, an hour-long program that's been composed by half a dozen different composers. And it themed entirely around Ecocide Law, and absolutely beautiful. This was, the Helsinki Concert Hall seats, 1,700 people. So 1,000 of those were actually singing at some points in that concert. It was really quite the most extraordinary thing. I was there in person. And it was followed by a panel that, where we discussed the issues that were raised in the concert. And it was just such an extraordinary cultural happening. And what it also really showed, and they'd actually done some research around this in the pilot program the year before with those who had learned the program and learned the songs and actually therefore engaged very directly with the subject matter. And the result was that over 90% of those singers stated that their worldview had been shifted as a result of learning about and singing those songs. And that's just what an extraordinary theory of change, and what an effective one, because all of those people are singing out of passion, but most of them also have day jobs, doing other things. And therefore, that message is then percolating through society in the most extraordinary way. And then looking at a completely different sector, and that's fashion. And fashion's very interesting in regard to this work because, of course, the materials involved are so wide-ranging that, they touch on so many of the potential sectors that will need to pay attention to this law. But we've been collaborating with a couture designer in London on something that kind of makes a statement about the fashion world. She's creating a single sort of art statement dress, if you like, that doesn't become a collection that gets manufactured and resold. Instead, it's one piece that many contributors contribute to. And our watchers can do this too. You can sponsor an endangered species of plant to be embroidered on this dress, which is going to end up with this beautiful coloured bodice and, with all these different sponsored flowers and Ecocide laws printed into the skirts. And then that is going to come on tour with us to New York Climate Week and to COP16 of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Colombia to draw attention to the issues around and to the Ecocide Law movement. And also, of course, just represent something very different that can be done with high fashion.
That's amazing. I think people talk about how they align the SDGs to individual policy proposals. And SDG 17 is notoriously difficult. International cooperation is notoriously difficult. But being able to literally and metaphorically orchestrate something like that and have fashion on your side so that you can speak to people in a way that they see as impactful on a daily and ordinary basis, I think that's next level. I think it's a great achievement. Well done. New York Climate Week is coming up rapidly. You've mentioned COP16, COP3, and you've talked about all the other international commitments you have on a piecemeal basis. Talk to us about what's next for Stop Ecocide International in your calendar.
So there are a number of events coming up over the rest of this year in which we'll be involved. I'm going to be in New York next week during the high-level political forum where the SDGs are discussed, and we've got a number of closed-door meetings at diplomatic level in that context. That's also really fascinating at the moment, the developments that are happening at that level, in the sense that, as I say, with the developments in Europe, things are moving forward on a much more kind of concrete basis. Obviously, with diplomatic developments, these things are never completely predictable, and all we can do is provide, expert advice and, help and support. But we think it's not impossible that a proposal to add Ecocide to the Rome Statute could emerge in the relatively near future. So that's obviously what we're aiming for, and that's very exciting, that possibility. There are obviously the usual kind of yearly events, if you like New York Climate Week, which happens at the same time as UN General Assembly Week in New York. We will definitely have a presence there. This year there is also a COP for the Convention on Biological Diversity, mentioned briefly before. That's going to be in Colombia this year, and we'll definitely be there with a significant team, as well as the one dress, the planet dress. And we will also be, we'll have some representation also at COP29 in Baku. We realise that it's quite controversial, the location of the COP this year, and many people are kind of, in a sense, skipping a year and thinking forward to Brazil next year. We believe it's still quite important for this Ecocide Law conversation to be present at that conference. So we will be sending a team to Baku as well. Finally, of course, and this is every year our absolutely key focus, is the Assembly of States Parties to the International Criminal Court. And this year it will be at home in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And so we will definitely be attending that alongside Vanuatu and a number of other interested states.
Excellent. When is that?
That's in December.
Good luck.
I think we're kind of beyond the luck stage. This is definitely a train that is running fast. And I think one of the things that we're realizing is that, we're almost victims of our own success in the sense that, the legislative side is really moving at a pace now. And what we're really looking to do is raise awareness in those sectors that really need to know about it. So particularly, for example, corporate sustainability officers. I mean, they're going to need to understand what's going on here so that they can be of use to their employers in this respect. At the time of filming, we're about to hold an event in a couple of weeks' time, specifically aimed at corporate sustainability officers so that they can get up to speed with the developments that are happening so fast on the global stage.
That's excellent and very important, because I think you imply this. Corporate sustainability officers have had to focus on climate and carbon for a very long time. But to think of climate and the round, including environmental, social, governance issues, but also, I think, really crucially, nature and biodiversity, I think there is a knowledge gap that needs to be filled there. And there is an issue of ambition, planning, and corporate awareness for ecocide that matters a lot. When and where will you be holding this sort of training?
This is online on the 17th of July. So depending on when this episode actually comes out, it may... Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well done, again. We usually finish with a call to action at the end of each of our episodes. And so, at the end of episode 9, what are your calls to action?
Well, actually, I've got a few. I'll just consult my notes. Well, firstly, we totally recommend everybody to look at the breaking news page on our website. It's my favorite page on the site. It's such an exciting kind of journal of the successes of this initiative. It's remarkable. And you'll see more detail about all the things we've been talking about. For example, you'll also be able to look up, for example, the articles that have come out around Ecocide Law in recent months. There was an op-ed from Michael Mansfield, human rights lawyer in the UK. Our Latin America's director, Rodrigo Lledó, had a fantastic piece in Open Democracy. And there are others that kind of emerge as we go, but it's a great place to go and look those things up. You can go and listen to that amazing concert that I was talking about from Helsinki. We link to that as well. And of course, if you actually sing in a choir or run a choir, you can download the whole program for free, and including rehearsal notes and how to approach it and all of this stuff, so you can actually put on one of these concerts in your locality. You can go and sponsor an embroidery on the One Dress Planet, and you can also, that's also linked to from our website and also from tammam.co.uk. That's the designer Lucy Tammam, tammam.co.uk. And perhaps finally, on a rather personal note, I got into all of this through a kind of very winding path. But my childhood was punctuated by a musical soundtrack. And that was my mother's singing and songwriting. And she was deeply inspired by the earth and by the seasons. And Stop Ecocide's Christmas present this year, if you want to call it that, is going to be a beautiful songbook of her songs, an illustrated songbook. And we're currently taking kind of pre-orders of signed copies as a form of, raising the print run costs. And if that's something that might interest you, you can find that also on our donate page.
That's beautiful, very touching. Thank you everyone for watching, and hopefully we'll see you next time on episode 10.
You're listening to the Ecocide Report, a monthly podcast from Stop Ecocide International and the Movement for Ecocide Law. Stop Ecocide International is working tirelessly to get ecocide recognised by the International Criminal Court, but we need your help. If you value this content or want to support the work of Stop Ecocide International, you can become a patron over at patreon.com for just 1 hour's wage per month. Your support makes our work possible, and we can't thank you enough. You've been listening to the Ecocide Report. You can find out more about all of the issues discussed in this episode via the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.